I call it appropriate, not least because it is in Mary Magdalene, that the soul, an entity ultimately immeasurable, perhaps infinite, finds its scenic, dramatically visual expression. Viewed psychologically, she is the anima, the personification of the soulfully mediating bridge between the divine and the human ego. This is also how I portrayed her in my story Magdalene at the Tomb and in the Easter novel Corpus Christi. I confess that since childhood, no image has fascinated me more than that of the resurrection. Here, all I can do is point to the psychological fact of compensation. In this sense, I understand both of Jesus' seemingly contradictory instructions as medicine given with the intent to compensate for certain weaknesses in Magdalene and Thomas. These are typical weaknesses, but they do stand in the way of experiencing the mystery of the resurrection. Magdalene's desire to touch does not doubt the physical body. After all, she was looking for it, but wants to be reunited with her beloved, who, in the resurrection scene in John's Gospel, stands before her in the flesh as he was. This view, therefore, tends towards regression and does not yet see the transformation, doesn't yet see Jesus as the transformed one. The desire to touch him, therefore, still clings to the physical dimension and obscures the supra-personal fact, the spiritual view of the resurrection that transcends all reason. With Thomas, the situation is just the opposite. He doubts the body of the risen one. That is, he doubts the, as it were, rock-solid fact of the transpersonal, the miracle of transformation. Both of their opposing experiences, the "don't touch me" and the "put your hand in my wound" moments, lead them individually to the same goal, the recognition of the mystery. Quote, "The kingdom is within you and without you," says Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas. This summarizes the meaning of Jesus' two instructions one more time. In general, one might say that the difficulty Jesus' disciples were having after Easter in recognizing the risen one corresponds to our difficulty today to recognize the new consciousness. We still don't see it. Yes, but believe, not in the sense of just shut your eyes, you have to believe that. Rather in the sense of the Pauline pistis, a Greek word that Luther translated as belief. Yet pistis actually means faithfulness, a faithfulness that is based on personal experience, that has examined the content of this experience and now stands by it. So what constitutes personal experience? Ultimately, it's always a psychological experience. But the ego has not made the psyche and does not know on what foundations it rests, as Edinger says. You know, at first I always wondered why Paul quotes Jesus on so few occasions, why he doesn't tell stories, never actually narrates in the letters we have of him, why, after Damascus, he doesn't go straight to the site of the resurrection in Jerusalem. Well, that's how a tourist would think. But Paul had himself experienced death and resurrection. The sight of the resurrection was within him, and to this he remained faithful. Everything was now based on that experience. That is resurrection as we also seek it, I think. The end of all stories, for there are no more words for this, because that is where I think all stories, all narratives actually are headed. That's where they want to go. They circumambulate this goal, gravitate around this center. All stories do, circling around it like courtiers in courtship, consciously or unconsciously, in ever new attempts to break through to that tree of life once hidden from us. And perhaps we too could find resurrection, I think to myself, not at the bottom of that fountain of time 2,000 years deep, but now, every night, in the depth of our soul, faithful, as it were, to the mystery of its foundations, faithfulness, pistis, fidelity, to our own experience. Over the years, this has also developed into my conception of dreams as the substance of a nightly communion, of dreams as God's offering to us, and of them, the dreams, as the sacrifice of a dark soul substance, a deep, still dark content that the dreamer is not yet aware of, but which is offered up for us, passed through to us across the darkness of the night, namely from the sacrificer, that is, from the unconscious, depth psychologically speaking, from the self, theologically speaking, from God, to us. It is not we who act in this nocturnal individual supplement to the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, but we are individually its receiving vessel, its skoios eklogas, the vessel of a divine choice, through which this substance of his is given to us as nourishment. He wants to realize himself in us, still further and ever more, one might say, to continue to incarnate in us through the host of the dream substance. When you say moves, you're hinting at the essential. Here, I don't follow the external calendar. When I'm strongly moved by something, when my inner being is set in turmoil, when I'm suffering and life threatens to come to a standstill or to enter a new powerful flow, something we also fear, something we even try to evade, then on a small scale, in the microcosm of my life, the pattern of a passion and an impending resurrection becomes visible. It's the pattern that underlies such upheaval. It traces the two opposite sides of the same archetype. The passion, as one might call this phase, is always the prerequisite for a resurrection. Quote, "Unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears ripe fruit," says Jesus. Perhaps we should learn, as Jesus suggests, to experience the parable of the resurrection again in small ways, in the small events of our everyday lives, in the undervalued and neglected dreams reaching us, reaching for us every night. We should gain the courage to stand by such experiences and, as I said, remain loyal to them. That's an interesting view. I would put the emphasis slightly differently. What you describe, the human reactions to the Easter event, are somewhat less important to me. Rather, it is what is expressed in the Easter symbol, the triumph over human intellect. Human understanding is surpassed. The woeful Ecclesiastes reasoning of man, which, however, has its time, its necessary function, comes to an end here in the Easter event, once and for all. And the heart knows this. The soul does not have to believe it. It knows this. The soul is naturalita religiosa. In its nature, its essence, it is related to the highest value. The religious view is innate to it. What knows, when I say it knows, is naturally older, is 1,000 times wiser than the little ego that we rightly and bravely claim, but which paradoxically experiences its greatest triumph in its defeat, in the defeat of the ego. Quote, "But now Christ has risen from the dead," says Paul, who experienced him in body and soul. Easter is the symbol of the message of victory over death, over the human end, over the limits we know and by which we know as human beings. Message of victory is, after all, one of the meanings of the Greek word euangelion, gospel. Easter is the symbol of the message of victory that finally reconnects us finite ones to the infinite. Who can stand when he appears, says the prophet Malachi.